this video, I want to continue the series that we just started talking about, like what racial capitalism looks like on the workers' strike resolution. I think that if you are still wanting to read arguments about Marxism, arguments about capitalism, then this is the route that you're really going to want to go down against like a lot of these workers' strikes affirmatives, and the route that I think that is the best way for you to make an affirmative that allows you to still talk about Marxism while winning like really core, like strong arguments about why the resolution is kind of limited in its ability to really deal with racial capitalism. I think that in this particular set of videos that I'm about to start, I really want to talk about the relationship between racial cap as a negative strategy versus policy teams, because I definitely feel like it's a strategy that is really viable, but I think a lot of teams might be frightened from if they've read this argument in the past in only one particular way, because I definitely think it requires you to make a lot more anti-reformist arguments and really have like a longer history of the way in which the state is related to various types of like communist organizations that refuse to be like properly recognized or refuse to like play by the kind of like rules that come with like a like framework that's kind of recognized by the law, and why that kind of like is necessary to like maintain the militancy and like dangerousness of like what that alternative kind of resistance looks like. And so in this video, I kind of want to continue with that and talk a little bit about some of the stuff that we mentioned from the intro, and then develop that into just like thinking about what are some of the priorities for like what reading this argument looks like against policy teams, and then like some of what the framing kind of thesis concerns look like in order for you to be able to set up a really strong top level debate that kind of sets up the fundamental differences between your arguments and the affirmatives at the level of methodology, but also at the level of how you're considering Marxism, which I think is really important, because I think that a lot of these affirmatives will kind of like throw workers' strike out there, and I feel like you need to really like stick them to like how they're like conceiving of what the worker is and like what kind of defines that, because I feel like a lot of the times these teams will either A, like have really ambiguous decisions or ambiguous definitions, or B, that they'll kind of like huddle really into like strong Marxist interpretations of like what it means to be worker. And I feel like those are places where you can also bring a lot of offense, a lot of in-depth nuanced debating that I think makes these debates a lot easier for you to win once you get to like more mutual exclusivity portion of the debate that happen kind of later on. I think that when we're just generally thinking about what are some of the main priorities of reading this argument versus policy teams, I think that you really need to set a really strong understanding of what racial capitalism is. I feel like there are so many people that just misunderstand it and assume that it's just an argument that says that like, you know, race is the root cause of capitalism, or that we should think about like race and capitalism. And I really think that people need to look at it a lot more nuanced, a lot more specifically, because I feel like there are a lot of arguments that various authors that have really brought up the terminology racial capitalism have really theorized it to mean something about the way in which we're thinking about Marxist interpretations of like history, organizational principles, etc., that are really central to the ways in which we think about like the role that we kind of like play in relationship to capitalism as a whole, and why our kind of like normalized understanding of like what Marxism looks like requires an essentialized view of the worker that blocks us out from thinking of like so many other vacuums of resistance like that are like created by systems of capitalism, but are separated differently than like the clean lines that Marx is kind of like using in his like original writing, and that are carried into a lot of like interpretations that like Marx is kind of like used today to like justify things like the kind of like use of the workers' strike as like something that needs to be properly recognized by the state. And so I think that when you're able to really win a strong concrete argument about the role that kind of like theorizing of Marxism does in terms of the way in which it separates various types of forces of resistance, and the way in which that can like turn into various performances of authoritarianism that hide the relationship between the state and privatized entities, which I think is another place to draw a lot of really interesting debate about, ultimately allows for capitalism to continue and create divisions that further otherize those that are already kind of like hidden under like normative Marxist interpretations, but are also being violated by the state's ability to take away their like relationship to human rights that kind of like gives them access to the paradigm of the worker in the first place. So when I'm thinking about what this kind of looks like at just a general framing level, I feel like a lot of the things that you really want to make is that this debate should kind of be like a way in which we think about like tactic choices and resistance choices. And I feel like you need to make like a bunch of arguments about like why the kind of like endorsement of the state's ability to recognize the workers' strike ontologizes like what the like paradigm for how movements should like relate to the state looks like, and ultimately like over limits our ability to access tactics necessary to resist capitalism, because of the way of which it refuses our like necessary understanding of how like racial dispossession separates like various types of like people of color, Black and Native people specifically, from the normative like paradigm of like what the worker is and looks like. And I feel like a lot of these arguments are like like really strong in terms of being able to win why at an educational level they're important, because like I think that there are a lot of like indices that you can make of how fiat as a tool in cases like these are basically used in order to destroy our ability to actually like prepare and create different ways of like understanding there are different ways of understanding like what organizing a worker strike looks like and what it really looks like to get beyond capitalism, besides just saying that like this thing is an eventuality and will happen because we read it. In actuality, like the necessity for making a worker strike like impactful and useful even in the world where the state recognizes it is by wondering like what types of tactics legitimize and reinforce the same type of things that workers are like trying to protect themselves from, because like in the real world companies will make small appeasements and other things that try to convince workers to end the worker strike, which doesn't actually allow for an empowering or a change at a systematic level. It only kind of allows for like contingent responses to like various places where capitalism shows up, but that doesn't actually deal with how textured that violence ends up actually being. And I think that that type of like set of arguments can really allow you to build offense against both the education and procedural kind of values that they're getting out of this, because I feel like there are so many good arguments, especially in a world of COVID, why the particular way in which we think about like the role that the worker plays and the role that those that are excluded from like the paradigm of worker play in like the way in which like capitalism is able to accumulate, and how it is able to do so unethically in a world where, you know, people are being like moved out of their homes, forest fires are being begun in California, that prisoners are being forced to fight at unfair labors, etc. What does it really look like to give access to a different way of understanding how we're able to resist based off of a detailed debate about those types of tactics, instead of one that is just about the effect of an eventual worker strike that is not here yet? I think that secondary to that, you have a lot of really good arguments to make at the thesis level about why this is kind of like where I think a lot of your debate about Marxism really starts, but about why the way in which they're considering what calcifies itself as the worker misunderstands how like the worker and the way in which they're tying it to human rights as like two things that kind of become one. That is like the human right to be worker to strike basically requires a really like not just humanist interpretation, but basically requires a way of understanding a particular class of those that have access to like land, labor, value, liberty, and freedom. But when you think about things like racial capitalism and the way in which, for instance, things like the carceral state are able to produce like the kind of like stature to take away the rights of those that they take into the prison, right? And the way in which they're able to like create forms of forced servitude, etc. How can that be like calcified or understood under the value of the worker? And how can those things then be like used in order to create a paradigm for like those people to resist in a way that isn't delegitimized, that isn't like policed because of the way in which they are stripped from like that originary value of human right, and how that like kind of like a theory of not being like solidified as worker because of forced servitude kind of like basically sews in and makes impossible for us to theorize resistance beyond like the free wage like worker that is able to already assert themselves as human and as agent, which doesn't answer the ways in which things like slavery and colonial dispossession accrue resources through the continued like carceral system and the continued reliance on the dispossession of such communities in order to exclude them from the paradigm of a worker, thus making it harder to organize. Hopefully this video helps you, and hopefully you'll tune into the other videos I'll be doing talking about capitalism and the Cap K on the workers strike resolution. And yeah, thanks.